When you build a civilization, you're bound to get a few rats. In the 19th century, London's population exploded from about 1 million in 1800 to well over 6 million by the century's end. This breakneck pace of urban growth, fueled by industrialization and migration, created vast and densely packed working-class districts. Those elegant squares and gaslit boulevards of the rich sat just a stone's throw from the overcrowded slums, the notorious rookeries, where crime and poverty festered. And it is within these shadowy quarters that an underclass emerged that many Victorians feared as a dangerous class of professional criminals. Amid these conditions, organized street gangs took root. Yet the reality of the Victorian street gang was quite complex. These gangs ranged from loose confederacies of young toughs in Whitechapel alleys to highly organized syndicates with strict hierarchies and even international networks. Some gangs were defined by neighborhood loyalties, others by ethnic ties or specialized criminal enterprises. Many were short-lived gangs of youths, infamous for brawling and petty theft, but a few of them became long-standing criminal fraternities. What unified these groups was the environment that produced them. Extreme overcrowding, unemployment, and the lack of legitimate opportunity forged tight-knit brotherhoods of the desperate. Competition for survival in the slum was fierce, and youths banded together for protection and profit, sometimes forming gangs that ruled entire streets or tenements by intimidation. So that's our story for today. The story of the lowest rungs of society in the poorest parts of the city. It's not one that's often told, so it's best that we talk about that. Fortunately for us, we have plenty of primary source material. So before we begin, let me issue the customary welcome to the channel. Hello to anybody who's joining. If you've just discovered us, or you're yet to click the subscribe button, I invite you to do so. You'll get plenty more of this kind of content. And I will remind you that this video and all the videos in the playlists are all ad-free. You won't get interrupted. Watch it all the way from start to finish without a problem. And that is because we are supported on this channel by the Patreon members, the YouTube members, those who check out the merch store, and the occasional donation, and also through your word of mouth sharing with family and friends. We do appreciate that. So, with all that being said, you'll find the appropriate links in the pinned comment and video description, and we can begin our video today back to Victorian London, the lowest and dirtiest areas that we can find. Well, we best set the scene. What exactly are we dealing with here? We're dealing with towering wealth and imperial splendor, coexisting with some of the worst urban poverty on earth. The city's east and south districts were particularly synonymous with overcrowded slums, where whole families might inhabit a single airless room in a crumbling tenement. By the 1880s, areas like Whitechapel, Bethnal Green, St. Giles, and Lambeth had become densely packed rookeries, that's what they called them, notorious for disease, dirt, and crime. Oh, and don't worry, that doesn't mean that the rent's any lower. The landlords were still ripping people off. Seems to be a human trend, I'm afraid. Well, the social structure of Victorian Britain, rigidly stratified by class, meant that upper and middle class reformers often viewed these slum neighborhoods as a world apart, a kind of netherrealm of vice and filth. The people of the rookeries were later residuum, or criminal class, deemed almost a separate breed born to crime. and it was this dehumanizing attitude that helped justify the aggressive policing and harsh penalties focused on the poorer districts. Rapid urbanization only heightened these problems. London's expansion was fed by mass migration. Rural laborers driven off the land by industrialization poured into the city looking for work, as did waves of immigrants. The Irish were among the first. By the 1850s, refugees from the Great Famine had settled in such numbers that Irish-born made up about 20% of the London population, clustering in areas like Whitechapel and Southwark. Well, later, in the 1880s to 90s, tens of thousands of Eastern European Jews fleeing pogroms arrived and settled mostly in the East End ghettos around Whitechapel and Spitalfields. These new arrivals added to the cultural mosaic of the slum, sure, but also to the anxieties of the native Londoners, who often scapegoated immigrant communities for crime. Indeed, some East End gangs did take on ethnic identities. For example, a Jewish gang led by Isaac Darky the Coon Bogart operated in the late 1880s, and other groups of foreign-born ruffians were noted too. The press later dubbed them Bessarabian and Odessian gangs, exoticizing their origins. As for living conditions, well, they were the real incubator for crime. Basic infrastructure like sanitation, lighting, and policing was woefully inadequate in the poorer quarters. Streets were often unlit at night, and the maze-like alleys and courts provided plenty of hideouts for thieves. Overcrowding and unemployment meant that many youths grew up half-starved and unsupervised, learning to steal or beg as a means of survival. Victorian social observers drew a direct link between such deprivation and the formation of gangs. As one memoirist commented, "In the worst slums, every man's hand was against his neighbor, and youth banded together in gangs for mutual defense and predation." A climate of casual violence pervaded these neighborhoods. Street fights, drunken brawls, domestic abuse, everyday occurrences, normalizing brutality for the young. So it's no surprise that in such an environment, street gangs emerge as a form of self-organization among the most marginalized, offering their members protection, identity, and a livelihood, albeit an illicit one. Our middle and upper-class Londoners looked on these developments with a mix of morbid fascination and horror. The concept of a criminal underworld took hold in the Victorian imagination. A hidden city right under their noses, populated by thieves and gangsters. This idea was reinforced by popular literature and journalism. Of course, we all know about Charles Dickens. He famously depicted a proto-gang of pickpockets led by the conniving Fagin in Oliver Twist in 1838, set in the rookeries of an earlier era. In the 1860s, newspapers whipped up fear during the garroting panic, with lurid stories of armed ruffians strangling gentlemen on public streets. We'll get to that a little bit later, too. In any case, by the 1880s, the East End had become a byword for danger, especially after the infamous Jack the Ripper murders of 1888. But before the Ripper's identity as a lone serial killer was established, police initially suspected that a gang might be responsible, noting that early Whitechapel murder victims had been attacked by groups of men. In the climate of that year, this theory seemed quite plausible. Several violent gangs were known to operate in the area, and one night worker, Emma Smith, had indeed been fatally assaulted by what she described as 3 gang members. The idea of a gang of killers prowling Whitechapel further fueled the public panic. An East End vigilante community was formed, and newspapers as far away as Liverpool speculated whether London's murders were inspired by the Liverpool High Rip Gang, who were then in the headlines. Victorian moralists and social reformers also seized on gang crime as proof of the urgent need to civilize the slums. The class bias in perceptions of crime was very strong. When crimes occurred in wealthier areas, or by respectable folk, they were often downplayed or rationalized, whereas crimes emanating from the slums were treated as existential threats to society. An illustrative example was the response to shoplifting. Middle-class women caught pilfering trinkets from London's new department store were rarely prosecuted in court. Out of shame or perhaps disbelief at their fall from respectability. But by contrast, a gang of lower-class women thieves could be painted in the press as a band of incurable delinquents. In fact, Victorian shop staff were so reluctant to accuse well-dressed ladies of theft that many such cases just went unpunished, a reticence that benefited the female thieves who dressed respectably to avoid suspicion. The disparity did not go unnoticed. One contemporary noted that society's indulgence towards kleptomania in rich ladies was never extended to a poor girl from Lambeth caught stealing. Rules for me and not for thee, I suppose. Well, summing all that up, the social context for Victorian London's gangs was defined by inequality and fear in the extremest extents. The slums acted as pressure cookers of poverty and crime, while the wider public alternately ignored these enclaves or erupted in panic over their inhabitants' misdeeds. Now, this is more about gangs, this video, so we're going to move on from that, but keep within the context of the root causes of crime. But if you want to know more about the London slums in particular, I made a full video on that a while back. You should be able to find it in the Britain playlist. But in any case, let us move on to the gangs. So we know the East End of London, especially the poverty-ridden district of Whitechapel, Spitalfields, Bethnal Green and Shoreditch, produced some of the most infamous street gangs of the Victorian era. Now these neighbourhoods, with their warren of courts and alleys, provided both the recruiting grounds and the hunting grounds for criminal gangs. So let's talk about a few of the most notorious East End gangs. First, the Old Nickel Gang. They were one of the earliest gang names to send shivers up the spines of middle-class Londoners, reputed to rule the Old Nickel slum in Bethnal Green. The Old Nickel was by the 1880s one of London's most squalid rookeries, a maze of dilapidated cottages around Nickel Street, teeming with destitute families. It gained such a fearsome reputation that a later writer described it as home of a notorious pack of cutthroats known as the Old Nickel Gang. I'm sure they weren't putting that on the real estate brochures. Well, contemporary police were certainly aware of a violent clique of robbers operating there, that's for sure. In April 1888, for instance, a night worker named Emma Smith was attacked and fatally injured by local roughs near Brick Lane. The attack was widely attributed to the Old Nickel Gang, who was said to extort and terrorize women working on their turf. Little survives in official records about the internal hierarchy or membership of the Old Nickel Gang. Like many slum gangs, it didn't have a formal leadership structure or written code, but rather was a shifting group of the toughest local men and teenage boys banded together by kinship or street alliance. They were known for violent muggings and robbery. The term gang in this context may be somewhat fluid. It could refer to a specific crew of repeat offenders, or more generally to any group of nickel roughs who teamed up for a crime. Victorian press reports often exaggerated these gangs' organization to heighten the drama. Once again, you've got to sell the papers, don't you? But what is clear is that the old nickel mob engaged in turf wars with rivals from neighbouring areas. The nickel rookery bordered the district of Hoxton to the west, and there were accounts of pitched street battles between the old nickel boys and the Hoxton Market gang in the 1880s. Essentially, it was primitive gang turf wars, fought with fists, stones, boots, knives, whenever rival groups crossed paths or disputed territories. Now, the culture of Old Nickel was later immortalized and to a degree mythologized by author Arthur Morrison in his 1896 novel A Child of Jargo. Morrison's Jargo is a barely fictionalized Old Nickel, and he depicts its young protagonist being drawn to a life of gang crime almost inevitably. In one scene, an older mentor points out two well-dressed criminals, members of the so-called high mob of professional burglars, and he tells the slum boy, "That's your aim in life. It's the best the world has for you, for the Jargo's got you, and that's the only way out, except jail and the gallows. So do your devil most, or God help you, though he won't, for the Jago's got you." Pretty grim counsel, isn't it? Surely knows how to motivate the youngsters. Shows how hopelessly trapped in crime that many slum youths felt. Morrison also described the Jargo, that old nickel, as permanently at war with a neighbouring area called Dove Lane in the novel, representing a real adjoining slum. The feud between the Jargo and Dove Lane was eternal, he writes, with any excuse, a private quarrel, a theft, an insult, sufficient enough to spark a full-scale faction fight. Such gang feuds could last days, with running battles in the streets until police finally intervened. So given the utter destitution of Old Nickel, the methods of its gang were likely crude. Robbery with violence, that is, mugging, that was a hallmark. They were even suspected in the unsolved murder of a man in 1887, and initially in Jack the Ripper's murders until that theory was dismissed. They probably also engaged in burglary of nearby shops or warehouses when opportunity arose, and controlled local fences, that is, pawn shops or pubs where stolen goods were sold. Extortion was another tactic. Shopkeepers or street traders in the slum might pay protection money to the local gang for safety. We hear hints of this in later testimony about the hooligan gangs, who would demand a fee from shopkeepers on threat of trashing the shop, a practice likely carried on earlier by gangs like the Old Nickels. Women could be involved too. Some tough nickel woman acted as accomplices, decoys, or receivers of stolen goods. And indeed, the Old Nickel area was famous for its baby farmers and female criminals as much as its male roughs. If you want to know about baby farmers, have a look at my video on Victorian England serial killers. You'll find that in the Serial Killers and Undesirables playlist, if you dare. Well, ultimately, the Old Nickel slum, and by extension its resident gang, met an ironic fate. In the early 1890s, horrified by description of the nickel in Morrison's work and in social reports, authorities undertook one of London's first slum clearance projects. The Old Nickel's rotting slum houses were demolished and replaced by a model housing estate, that is the Boundary Street estate, opened in 1900, aiming to improve living conditions. Of course, this broke up the neighborhood's entrenched criminal networks. By Edwardian times, one would no longer fear an Old Nickel gang. The rookery that birthed it was gone, and without Old Nickel, there certainly couldn't be an Old Nickel gang, couldn't there? But in the Victorian years, The name alone had struck fear, symbolizing the savagery ascribed to the East End desperados. Of course, the old nickel gang was far from alone. Many other gangs prowled East End in the late 19th century, each with its own specialty or turf. So let's talk about a few of the minor gangs. First, we have the Blind Beggar Mob, a gang of pickpockets and thieves named after the Blind Beggar pub on Mile End Road, which served as their meeting spot. Despite being based in Whitechapel, the Blind Beggar Mob ironically carried out many of their thefts in the West End, travelling to upscale shopping districts or crowded events like racetracks to work the wealthy crowds, before retreating back to the East End slum. They were essentially racecourse pickpockets, targeting gentlemen at sporting events and using the East End as a safe haven. Next, we have the Hoxton High Rips, also called the Hoxton Mobs, a notoriously violent crew from Hoxton Shoreditch. The moniker High Rip, borrowed from Liverpool's feared High Rip Gang, implied a gang inclined to stab first and ask questions later. In fact, the police at one point suspected the Hoxton High Rips of committing the Ripper murders, given their record of knife attacks. While that theory proved wrong, it indicates how feared this gang was. They engaged in robbery and assaults too, and the term high ripping became synonymous with gratuitous and unfeeling gang violence. But then we have the Greengate Gang, who operated in Bethnal Green, likely named after a local landmark or pub, possibly the Green Gate. This gang was noted for theft and burglary in their district. They were an example of a neighborhood gang, asserting control over a patch of the East End and making life dangerous for outsiders or anyone who crossed them. Well, next we have immigrant gangs, the Bessarabians and Odessians. By the 1880s, East London police reports mentioned gangs of recent immigrant origin. One of them was dubbed the Odessa Gang, or the Odessians, referring to East European Jewish toughs from the Whitechapel and Spitalfields area. Another was called the Bessarabian Tigers in press law. These labels were often exaggerated by xenophobic press. However, it's true that ethnic gang fights did occur. For instance, Eastern European Jewish youths sometimes clashed with local English roughs or with Irish gangs, and they may have formed their own cliques for self-defense. Isaac Darky Bogard, mentioned earlier, was a real figure, a Jewish thief who led a gang called the Goons, slang term back then in the 1890s. These immigrant gangs engaged in everything from pickpocketing to staging street brawls, contributing to a volatile mix of East End crime. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. Victorian records hinted many more fleeting gangs and swell mobsmen, that is, flashily dressed thieves haunting the East End. Some gangs were family-based, brothers or cousins teaming up in crime. Others formed around a charismatic local boss, who might recruit a dozen young men as his crew. And then there were even child gangs, groups of feral children as young as 8 or 10, who would swarm market stalls to snatch apples or handkerchiefs. Mayhew recounted how such child thieves in Whitechapel operated in packs, with lookouts and dividing the loot, especially gangs in miniature. But one primary source that sheds light on the East End thievery is Henry Mayhew's interviews, that's for sure. He described categories of thieves as the bug hunters, those who roamed pubs to rob intoxicated patrons. Mayhew writes, quote, "They loiter about the streets and public houses to steal from drunken persons, and are called bug hunters and mutchers. You see many of them lounging about gin palaces in the borough at Whitechapel and St. Giles." These were essentially the proto-gangs of low thieves, often working in small groups to spot and fleece drunk victims. Likewise, he details how pickpocket gangs employed female accomplices and stick men, that is, male backup who received stolen goods and could pretend to be innocent bystanders ready to help, to rob in tandem. The picture is one of a vibrant criminal subculture, where even petty theft was organized along gang lines. The East End gangs typically had bloodlines between a friendship group and a criminal enterprise. Many members grew up on the same street or shared time in the same doss houses and pubs. Loyalty was personal. A gang might rally to protect one of their own from an angry victim, or to exact revenge if a member was harmed. Conversely, betrayals were dealt with brutality. The code of the street demanded retaliation to maintain fearsome reputations. As one contemporary noted regarding later hooligan gangs, witnesses were terrified to testify because it would be as much as their life was worth if they angered the gang. Well, this code of silence likely prevailed among earlier East End gangs too. Locals rarely informed on the toughs who lived among them, either out of fear or a shared antipathy towards the authorities. In any case, by the 1890s, the accumulation of East End gang violence and later media sensationalism led to a heightened pressure on the police to act, and as we'll see later on, high-profile trials such as the prosecution of Liverpool's High Rip Gang in 1888, and the public outcry after the Regent's Park murder by a London gang in the same year, prompted courts to hand down severe sentences to known gang members. The era of impunity for East End gangs was waning by the turn of the century, yet in Victorian times many gangsters still operated under an environment that pretty much was devoid of any proper policing, especially in the chaotic rookeries. But before moving on from the East End, it's worth noting how deeply the image of these gangs etched themselves into Victorian culture. Even after the fact, writers and social commentators used the East End gang as a symbol of urban deprivation. Chambermont, a 20th century author reflecting on the immigrant East End, still invoked the spectre of the old nickel pack of cutthroats, an emblematic image of the area's dark past. And so the legacy of these gangs contributed to that legend of East End London as a wild frontier, a perception that persisted well into the 20th century with the rise of later criminal firms. But in the context of Victorian London, the East End gangs, they were just one part of the city's underworld. Across the Thames in South London, another breed of gang was making its name, including one of the most unusual of all, an all-female gang that became quite legendary. But among London's gangs, none was more intriguing to contemporary observers than the 40 Elephants, an all-female criminal syndicate that shattered every single stereotype of Victorian womanhood. Operating out of the Elephant and Castle area of South London, this gang of young women, sometimes called the 40 Thieves, built a lucrative enterprise in a shoplifting and high-end theft. Now, they were remarkable not only for being exclusively female in membership, but also for their strict internal hierarchy and disciplined methods, which rivaled or even exceeded much of their male counterparts. The 40 Elephants gang is believed to have been active from at least the 1870s, possibly earlier, through to the end of the 19th century, or perhaps well into the 20th. Their name combined their home turf, Elephant and Castle, with the mythical 40 Thieves of Alibaba folklore, and indeed some speculated the name evolved on a play on Alibaba and the 40 Thieves, thus the 40 Elephants by association with the Elephant and Castle. Now, contrary to the fanciful idea that the group had simply 40 members, in reality the core membership in Victorian times was smaller, perhaps a dozen to 20 women, though the gang later expanded and had many associates. Under that gentle facade of Victorian ladylikeness, these women were professional thieves of great skill. A contemporary newspaper marveled that the 40 Elephants members often posed as upper-class women to avert suspicion while stealing. They dressed in fine clothing and carried themselves with the manners of respectable, aristocratic ladies, which allowed them to slip into high-end shops, elite hotels, or the homes of employers when working briefly as servants, without drawing the usual scrutiny police gave to slum girls. Once inside the gates of polite society, that's when they struck. The 40 Elephants were especially famed for shoplifting sprees targeting West End department stores and jewelers. They tailored their fashions to conceal loot, dresses with hidden pockets, voluminous crinolines and bustles that could hide bolts of fabric or furs, special cummerbunds and muffs with secret compartments, even hollowed-out hats where jewels could be tucked away. Exploiting the era's propriety, these lady thieves would squirrel away with expensive items and just walk out unnoticed. Victorian etiquette thus became their main ally. The 40 Elephants weren't just freelancers acting in parallel. They operated as an organized gang with clear leadership and rules. The first known leader or queen of the gang was Mary Carr, a formidable woman born in 1862, who by her mid-20s had unified what had been a loose sisterhood of shoplifters into a tight gang. Mary Carr is described in both court records and later accounts as charismatic, cunning, and ruthless when needed. One newspaper admiringly noted that she was, quote, noted for her good looks and engaging manners, and she managed to get around her a gang of young women who gave her a complete obedience as their leader. Under Carr's leadership, likely assumed in the 1880s, the 40 Elephants developed a clear hierarchy. Carr at the top, a few lieutenants, the older or more experienced thieves beneath her, and then the younger recruits, learning the trade. They also imposed strict rules on members, including how to divvy up proceeds and how to behave on missions. The gang demanded loyalty and discretion. If anyone broke ranks, for example trying to fence stolen goods independently or getting drunk and drawing attention, they would be disciplined internally. And that discipline was part of what made the 40 Elephants so hard for police to crack. The women closed around each other, rarely betraying secrets even under arrest. One detective later testified that nothing was done unless the Queen gave the order, showing the military-like chain of command that Miss Mary Carr enforced. The exploits of the 40 Elephants during Mary Carr's era were daring and wide-ranging. They raided London's grand establishment, from Liberty's to Harrods, from jewelers in the posh West End arcades to country boutiques, and even ventured on thieving trips to provincial towns when London got too hot. Their modus operandi for shop theft was often to descend en masse. A pair or trio of well-dressed women would enter a store and distract staff by trying on expensive items, while others quietly pocketed whatever they could. If one member was caught in the act, often she would feign outrage and play the part of an innocent lady wrongly accused, counting on chivalrous managers to let her go with minimal search, while the actual thief had already handed off the goods to an accomplice. The gang also masqueraded as housemaids on occasion, using forged references to get employed in wealthy households, and when they got in there, they just ransacked the place at the first opportunity. In hindsight, inviting a complete stranger into your house, even with forged references, if you don't know they're forged, still not a very wise thing. In any case, a frequent target was rich gentlemen's hotel rooms. Mary Carr herself was known to frequent West End hotels in disguise and steal jewelry from rooms, earning her a reputation as a talented jewel thief. Crucially, the 40 Elephants had an efficient fencing and distribution network. Stolen goods were not useful unless they were converted to cash, and these women excelled at that. Contemporary research by Brian MacDonald found that they employed a chain of fences across London. This shows a high level of organization. Essentially, a supply chain for stolen merchandise. They even extorted tribute from smaller female theft gangs operating elsewhere. During their heyday, they demanded that independent shoplifters either pay them a cut or face violent reprisal. It was said that the 40 Elephants could mete out a punishment as harsh as any male gang. One member, Maggie Hill, later famously blinded a policeman with a hat pin when cornered. Bad day on the job for that officer. Well, Mary Carr's reign was certainly eventful. Certainly conjures up a few images in our head. And it begs the question, why have they not made a movie about that yet? Often I do videos like this, and I just think, what are the filmmakers even doing? Why are we doing all of these Marvel films and superhero films when real life is so much more interesting? We don't need to make things up. History's got enough stories. Let's just make more films about that. I might actually watch them then. I don't watch any superhero films, by the way, just in case you're wondering. Not looking down on those who do, but it's just not my thing. Well, back to the video. Well, in 1895, the gang's activities burst into public view. You see, there was two scandals. First was their implication in the abduction of a child, a toddler named Michael McGee, whom gang members had apparently kidnapped, possibly for ransom or to aid a friend in a custody dispute. And secondly, a vicious attack on a female rival, Nellie Stanley, who was beaten for infringing on their territory. These incidents led to sensational trials in 1895 and 96 that were widely reported. At Mary Carr's trial for kidnapping in 1896, two Scotland Yard detectives testified that the prisoner was known as the Queen of the 40 Thieves, leading a gang of young females infesting the Strand, that is, London's theatre and shopping districts. Such testimony confirmed the authorities' recognition of the gang's existence. Carr was convicted and jailed in 1896. Newspapers delighted in the story of a female gang member. One called her the worst woman in London, a moniker that hints at both notoriety and, well, perhaps a few other old attitudes in Victorian reactions to women criminals. Well, while Mary Carr was in prison, leadership passed briefly to one of her lieutenants. Reports name Minnie Dugan as a successor who tried to hold things together. However, Carr got released a few years later and she resumed command. She continued her thieving career into the early 20th century, eventually retiring to Manchester, where she died in 1924. By 1900, though, the Victorian chapter of the 40 Elephants was closing, and a new generation was coming of age. In 1915, a young prodigy named Alice Diamond, who was nicknamed Diamond Annie, by the way, which is a great name for a career criminal, well, she became the gang's queen, leading them to even greater infamy in the 1920s. Under Diamond, the Elephants carried out smash-and-grab raids and society jewel heists that landed them on the front pages. The Daily Express in 1925 wrote that Diamond, quote, directed the entire operations of the gang. Nothing was done unless the Queen gave the order. It was essentially a continuation of the discipline structure that Mary Carr had established in earlier Victorian times. But it's worth emphasizing how unique the 40 Elephants really were. Female criminals in Victorian London were often solitary, petty shoplifters, receivers, fencers, etc. An organized all-female gang with the longevity and reach of the 40 Elephants is exceptional in British criminal history. They showed that women, too, could build a professional crime network, defying the era's gender norms. Interestingly, they were not isolated from male gangs. They had a bit of a strategic alliance with the local Elephant and Castle Mob as a male gang, to be discussed below, of course. And romantically, or perhaps familiarity, many elephants were linked to male criminals. But within their own operations, they maintained autonomy and proved fully capable of outwitting the law on their own terms. Parallel to the 40 Elephants, and often working in tandem with them, was the Elephant and Castle Mob. This was an all-male gang based in the same South London district, centered around the busy Elephant and Castle Junction. This gang, sometimes simply called the Elephant Gang or the Elephant Boys, rose to prominence in the late Victorian and Edwardian period. They were sort of a brother organization of the 40 Elephants, I suppose, while the women were specializing in stealthy theft and cons. The Elephant Castle Mob gained renown, or perhaps notoriety, for more overt racketeering, violence, and underworld entrepreneurship. In Victorian times, the Elephant and Castle area was a rough, working-class neighborhood, home to markets, thieves' kitchens, and cheap lodging houses. Fertile ground for gang activity if there ever was. By the 1890s, the Elephant Mob was one of the many independent street gangs in London's underworld, but it had the advantage of a prime territory straddling major roads from the city into South London, and a formidable reputation. The gang's alliance with the 40 Elephants is well attested. Sources note that the Elephants, female that is, were allied with separate male-led gangs in their vicinity, and specifically allied with the Elephant and Castle Mob. This alliance was mutually beneficial. The men could provide muscle and share criminal intelligence, while the women offered specialized skills, or perhaps even acted as fences or decoys for the men. According to one account, the male Elephant gang members, quote, admired the women for their organization and expertise, and they even acknowledged that the 40 Elephants could hold their own in street fights if needed. That goes to show you what kind of tough broads they had on there. Well, the leadership and structure of the Elephant and Castle Mob shifted over time. In the late 19th century, one known figure was Alf Gorman, described as a leader of the Elephant Gang during the 1880s and 90s. Gorman's prominence is highlighted by his personal ties. You see, he was romantically involved with Mary Carr, the queen of the 40 Elephants. Such a partnership likely cemented the alliance between the gangs and perhaps coordinated their activities. You can certainly imagine a kind of underworld power couple directing their crews. Gorman himself was reputedly a typical gang boss of the era, running protection rackets and organized robberies. By the early 20th century, and this is post-Victorian era, the Elephant and Castle Mob came under the rule of the MacDonald brothers, Charles and Walter, named Wag and Wall for short. Well, these two carried the gang into the interwar years, transforming it into a significant force on London's criminal scene. Under the MacDonalds, the Elephant Mob dominated illegal bookmaking and extortion rackets, especially at racetracks and urban betting rings. They forged alliance with other gangs like Birmingham's Brummagem Boys, and clashed violently with rival gangs such as the Italian-descended Sabini gang in the 20s. Though this heyday was slightly beyond Queen Victoria's reign, it had roots in the late Victorian organization of the gang, and we can infer that even in the 1890s, the Elephant and Castle Mob were involved in street-level violence, assaults, stabbings, robbery, and fencing stolen goods. The usual stuff. And they likely taxed the local illegal trades like unlicensed gambling or pub theft, and provided criminal services such as hired muscle. One crime closely associated with these South London gangs was prize fighting and gambling. Elephant and Castle had many pubs where illicit bare-knuckle boxing matches were arranged, and gang leaders often promoted and bet on these fights. The Elephant and Castle mob would have been deeply involved in this subculture, organizing fights, extorting fighters or promoters, and using the fights as a cover for betting scams. In 1888, for example, the murder of Joseph Rumbold near Regent's Park was committed by a group of South London hooligans after such a night of mischief. When one member, George Gallatley, was convicted of that murder, the press thundered at the police to do more about the gangs of young ruffians terrorizing the city. People had certainly had enough by this point. The outcry coincided with the crackdown on the High Rip gang in Liverpool, and the newspapers explicitly linked them. Quote, "We, too, have our High Rip gangs. A Fitzroy Square gang, a Marylebone Road gang, and also a gang in Seven Dials called the Deckers, with, I fear, many others." The Elephant and Castle mob was not named in that particular article we just quoted, perhaps because they kept a lower profile in 88, but it was certainly among the many others that the public worried about. Within a few decades, the Elephant mob would itself be highlighted as a prime example of gangland London, but during Victorian times it was somewhat overshadowed by the East End gangs, at least in the press coverage. The Elephant and Castle mob's methods could be brutally direct. They were known to commit highway-style robberies, attacking horse-drawn cargo wagons or coaches leaving the city, foreshadowing the later hijacking of vehicles in the motor age. And they engaged in counterfeiting and fraud, as police records later listed those among their activities. They also did smash and grab thefts from jewelers' windows, often in coordination with getaway drivers. In one case, a female 40 Elephants member, Lillian Goldstein, served as a getaway driver on the Elephant Gang heists. The gang cultivated corrupt relationships as well. By the 1890s, rumors swirled of policemen who were on the take in South London, bribed to turn a blind eye to the Elephant Gang's betting rooms and dice games. But what do you expect for the money that they make? Well, despite their crimes, gangs like the Elephant and Castle mob sometimes enjoyed a kind of strange local respect. They were seen as providers of a sort, hiring local boys for odd criminal jobs, spending money freely in local pubs, and even enforcing a rough order in their territory. Of course, the police weren't going to come in and sort out the troublemakers in the slums, so somebody had to do it. One South London folklore held that the Elephant boys protected their neighborhood from outside troublemakers, a sort of criminal honor code. But of course, they were also the ones instigating plenty of trouble themselves, so you give a little, you get a little. As of the 1890s, turning to a new century, increased police attention and the pressures of gang rivalry pushed the Elephant and Castle mob to evolve. The MacDonald brothers' ascendancy marked the gang's evolution from street thuggery to a more business-like mob that coordinated with other regional gangs and competed for lucrative rackets like racehorse extortion. One brother, Wag MacDonald, even went international, fleeing to America and allegedly becoming a bodyguard to a Los Angeles mafia boss in the 1920s. These later exploits go beyond our Victorian focus, but they do show the roots of organized crime in London that can be traced back to these late Victorian gangs. The Elephant and Castle mob bridged the era of fistfights and pub brawls into the era of syndicates and organized rackets. By the final decade of the 19th century, there was a new word that had entered the London vernacular: hooligan. It emerged in a newspaper police court report around 1894 to describe a gang of rowdy young toughs in Lambeth, South London, known as the Hooligan Boys. Within a few years, the term hooliganism was on everybody's lips, symbolizing a perceived upsurge in youth street gangs engaged in vandalism, brawling, and intimidation of locals. The hooligan phenomenon was essentially the Victorian precursor to what we'd now call teen gang culture. It provoked one of the era's biggest moral panics. Oh, how history repeats itself. Anybody living in Australia will know what I'm talking about. Well, the original Hooligan Boys gang in Lambeth was reportedly led by a youth named Charles Clark, or O'Houlihan, according to some accounts, giving the gang its name. They were described as a gang of youths who hung about the streets drinking, smashing windows, and picking fights. In 1898, their notoriety peaked when a gang member murdered a man named Henry Mappin during a street robbery in Lambeth. The murder, a senseless stabbing of a passerby, horrified the public and drew intense media attention. The Daily Graphic newspaper lamented, quote, "The avalanche of brutality, which under the name of hooliganism has cast such a dire slur on the social records of South London." The coroner at the inquest, Mr. Braxton Hicks, delivered a scathing commentary on the gang's behavior, noting that they scorned to do a stroke of work and obtained a living by blackmail. He detailed how groups of these young hooligans would storm into a shop and offer the owner a grim choice: either pay them a drink, which is a shilling or a few shillings for beer, or have his entire shop destroyed. Classic gang extortion, now inflicted not in some distant rookery, but on ordinary shopkeepers in various districts. Braxton Hicks further revealed the culture of intimidation around the Hooligan Boys. Witnesses in the Mappin murder were threatened that if they dared testify, their lives were in danger. Even the coroner himself and a magistrate received personal threats from the gang. Such bold defiance of law and authority by mere teenagers struck at Victorian sensibilities. The press response to these hooligan gangs was a full-blown moral panic. Newspapers ran alarmist pieces suggesting society itself was under siege by feral youth. The Sheffield Telegraph dubbed them young roughs, turning in parts of London into no-go zones, and many articles conflated all forms of youth misbehavior under the hooligan label, from pub fights and petty theft to serious assaults. The fact that these hooligans were seen as working-class youth out of control gave a bit of a class war tinge to the issue. Commentators wondered if the lower classes were breeding a generation with no respect for law or property. Comparisons were made to earlier panics. Some pointed out that it echoed the garrotting panic of the 1860s, or even the spectre of the criminal classes that Victorian reformers had long warned about. But it is important to note that while the hooligan panic was stoked by genuine incidents, like the Lambeth murder, it was certainly amplified by media sensationalism. Some journalists took a more skeptical view. Reynolds' newspaper, which was quite left-leaning in 1898, called it a lot of fuss and bother based on clubhouse panic, implying that gentlemen in their clubs were working themselves into hysteria over exaggerated stories. The Daily News, that is the name of the paper, not the general term, urged caution against wild, excited talk and exaggerated and fictitious stories. essentially accusing rival papers of creating a pantomime villain out of the hooligans for the public's morbid entertainment. And indeed, much as with the garrotters decades earlier, the statistics did not show a huge spike in violent youth crime. The idea of the hooligans spread faster than the actual gangs themselves. Nonetheless, the public reaction was very real. Neighboring vigilante communities formed. Police were deluged with calls to do something, and the Home Secretary was pressured in Parliament about the hooligan outrages. From the historical perspective, though, what the hooligan scare of 1898 shows is the continuity of gang phenomena and society's general response to it. You see, London always had rough youth gangs. Some scholars trace them back to the 18th century Mohawks and slaughterhouse gangs. But what changed was public visibility and the label. The flashy new term, hooligan, gave the press an easy banner to which to lump various gangs across the city. One could speak of hooligans in the East End, hooligans of Islington, etc. If those groups never coordinated or identified with each other, they'd still be thrown into the same term. The word was soon exported internationally to mean any rowdy young troublemaker. For the gangs themselves, being called hooligans probably meant little. They did not self-identify with that word initially, but they did become more brazen in the spotlight. In public court reports of 1898 to 1900, you can see cases of youths proudly calling themselves hooligan boys or even the hooligan boys, reveling in their notoriety. Their ages ranged from mid-teens to early 20s. Many were the sons of poor labourers or unemployed. They spent days idling and drinking, and nights roving in packs. A police court report from July of 1898 mentions a case of young prisoners said to belong to the hooligan boys, several members of which have already been punished for disorderly conduct. The magistrate's impatience was palpable. They were often sentenced to months of hard labor for relatively minor vandalism, simply due to the hooligan label. The methods of hooligan gangs leaned more towards spontaneous violence and public disorder rather than organized, profit-driven crime. They would assault random pedestrians. We might call it mugging, or sometimes it was just violence for violence's sake. They would also engage in big street fights with other gangs, much like modern gang fights in Australia or England, this kind of thing. And they would also vandalize property. Pretty much the exact kind of problems that we're having in Australia at the moment. Oh, our history repeats itself. Well, one signature hooligan move was the garrote and rob, eerily similar to what garrotting panics had described. Two hooligans would choke a victim from behind, while the third emptied his pockets. This was noted as a common trick, showing that hooligans had picked up the methods of earlier robbers. Law enforcement's response to the hooligan gangs was forceful. Police in Lambeth and Suffolk increased patrols and began to arrest known gang leaders on any charge they could pin: vagrancy, drunkenness, etc., if not outright assault. When brought to court, these youths often got exemplary sentences to make an example. In one noted case, a 19-year-old hooligan leader was sentenced to 20 strokes of the cat of nine tails in prison time for robbery with violence, a punishment aimed at deterring his peers by sheer terror. Such floggings had been reintroduced for violent crimes back in the garrotting panic, the Penal Servitude Act of 1864. But judges were now brandishing them again against these teenage criminals. The press largely applauded such tough measures. Sporting Life magazine in 1888 quipped that nothing had done more to scotch, if not kill, the high-rip gangs of Liverpool than heavy penal servitude sentences, and urged London judges to do likewise to any local gangsters. And this indeed became the approach zero tolerance by the courts. Unfortunately, not quite like our modern day, but you know. In any case, by 1900, the initial hooligan scare subsided into, as many gang members were jailed or drifted away, a pretty lukewarm scene of crime, I suppose. But the term stuck, and will be used in the new century to describe football rioters and other troublemakers, a linguistic legacy of Victorian London's gangland. The hooligan episodes underline a recurring pattern, moral panic amplifying the public perception of gangs, leading to stringent crackdowns that often had a class-skewed impact. While middle-class gangs of university students rioting, yes, those existed too, Oxford-Cambridge scuffles, were seldom treated as existential threats, but a gang of working-class boys in Lambeth became a symbol of societal decay. So in closing, you can't help but draw parallels between the garroting panic of the 1860s and the hooligan panic of the 1890s. In both, the media fanned the flames. The public donned metaphorical and literal armor. In 1862, some men actually wore anti-garroting collars, by the way, with spikes on them. That ought to stop them. And the state responded with harsher laws. For garroting, they brought back flogging. For hooliganism, they enforced it. Both panics, while based on real crimes, were out of proportion to statistical reality. But they had lasting influence on law and public policy. They contributed to an image of Victorian London as a city under perpetual threat from the dangerous underclass and their gangs. And that's an image that still is quite fascinating today. And so there you have the gangs of Victorian London and a little bit beyond. I hope you enjoyed it. Perhaps you can see some parallels to our modern day, depending on what countries you live in. You know what I mean. I don't want to get too much into modern things. We can't do that, can we? In any case, what I will do is thank the very good people supporting the channel on the mid and top level tiers. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfred, Near, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Dowry, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, and Are You My Mum? It's the name of the supporter, not a question. In any case, that is enough from me today. So I will thank you, and I will see you when you feel like returning. Good night, everyone, and lots of love to you all as always.